Good morning. Thank you for joining us here today. Normally, I would open by saying Happy Friday, but this week has been heart-wrenching and difficult for many Wisconsinites. On Sunday, Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back, we're mere arm's length away from his children. I'm asking us all to take a moment this morning to send thoughts of healing, prayers, or whatever is love and light for you to Jacob Blake and his family in this moment, and also to acknowledge the Black men, women, and children in this state and across the nation that are continually disproportionately affected by systemic racism and oppression in the United States. Thank you. I'd also like to recognize the other pandemic that is happening in our country right now, particularly because this call is a predominantly female audience. I thank you and am deeply grateful for the fact that you are all taking time from your morning to join us and to listen to what Jennifer and I have to share today when I know how busy your schedules are in our current pandemic times. I'd like to give you a moment to take a deep breath and to also acknowledge yourself for the perseverance and strength and resilience that you are showing during this time. In times of life change by the multitude, juggling more roles than one person can even feasibly juggle, and a news cycle that is more heartbreaking and terrifying by the day. I see the struggle. I am very deeply in it with you. As you can probably see by my technological challenges potentially today, but I also see the profound strength that women are showing in this moment. And so please join me in taking a moment just to acknowledge the strength and resilience that you have exhibited and to celebrate yourself. Thank you. My name is Kayla Gross, and I'm a graduate student in the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis program at UW-Madison. I'm also the Special Projects Manager and Research Assistant at Wisconsin's Equity and Inclusion Laboratory, and most recently, I have launched Equity U, an organization that provides affordable and accessible women's leadership education focused on the systemic barriers that impede their progress. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Jennifer Schmeiser. She is a board member of Wisconsin Women's Network. I'm not going to take too much away from her and her opportunity to share her own bio today, but I wanted to mention Wisconsin Women's Network and why I wanted them a part of this presentation today. As we are learning in this moment of increased racial awareness, education is not sufficient. We must turn it into advocacy. And when it comes to gender equity, that is no different. The Wisconsin Women's Network is doing tremendous work and is a tremendous resource, not only to those living in the Madison community, but across the state, and helping to empower women to make change at the systemic level, both as leaders in their community and influencing larger policy. So Jennifer, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kayla, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today for this very important discussion. I am Jennifer Schmeiser. I have over 20 years experience working in corporate human resources and we'll talk a little bit about how that experience has showed up in some of these practices today. I've worked in 6 organizations across 5 different industries, so lots of various experience, and have turned that into running my own business, HR4D Consulting, where I provide executive coaching and strategic HR consulting to organizations. I'm a board member of Wisconsin Women's Network, and I'm primarily involved in their mentorship program, which pairs college-age women with a professional mentor for a year-long program where they help them prep and launch into their career. It's a great program if any of you want to check that out. So thank you again for joining us today, and Kayla, off to you.
So thank you again, Jennifer. We are here today to talk about best practices and real-life advice for advancing gender equity and preserving women's participation in the workforce. Our agenda for today contains 4 components. 1, we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on women in the workplace. Secondly, we are going to touch on, as the title suggests, the best practices for gender equity, and we're going to touch on 3 specific subsections. We're going to look at the legislation that influences how organizations are able to treat their employees and what rules they have surrounding gender equity in the workplace on a policy level. We're then going to look at evidence-based solutions. What does the research say on how organizations can best ensure gender equity? And finally, Jennifer is going to share with us what this looks like in terms of implementation and practice. What do these principles, when applied in the organizational context, actually look like and work to achieve? We're going to close today with some closing recommendations that we hope you take away from this presentation, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A. We all regret that this presentation is virtual. I very much wish, and I know Jennifer shares the sentiment, that we were all in person for a more interactive discussion. And so please use the chat function today to share comments, to add additional insights. Please use the chat function to make this as interactive and community-oriented as we can and really build fellowship during our time here together this morning. Let's talk about the impact of COVID-19 on women in the workplace. Before we understand the impact of the current moment, we have to understand where we were previously. And so despite the fact that women are enrolled in higher education and graduating with degrees in higher number than men, they're also at gender parity, which means they're about equal when it comes to the general workforce population. They're still drastically underrepresented in terms of executives, particularly in the C-suite. Only about 1 in 5 C-suite executives in 2019 was a woman, and only 1 in 25 of those was a woman of color. There are still nearly 13 companies run by a man for every company run by a woman. And I want to open this up to a poll. So I'd love to get audience feedback on what do you think are the top 4 contributing factors to gender inequality in the workplace. And I'll give you a moment to read these and cast your vote. Give it just a few more seconds here. Okay. Thank you all for voting. If you selected option 2, you are correct. So 4 of the primary contributing factors to gender inequality are occupational segregation, family roles and responsibilities, bias and discrimination, and organizational and legal policies. And let's break down what each of these mean. So occupational segregation refers to the fact that most industries are actually predominantly made up of workers of one gender. So they're either predominantly male or predominantly female, as you can see by that illustrated on this graph. This also correlates with earnings. So industries that are predominantly female dominated equate to lower average earnings per year. This also equates to race and ethnicity. So industries that are predominantly made up of people of color also tend to have statistically lower earnings as well. Progress towards integration of industries has slowed in recent decades. And this occupational segregation concept, so the fact that women and men are segregated into different occupations, has been attributed to up to 50% of the wage gap. Moving on to family roles and responsibilities. This graph is difficult to read, but what you can take away from it predominantly is that women and mothers are represented by the purple bars on this graph, and men and fathers are represented by the red bars. And this graph represents average hours per day that parents spend caring for and helping in their household, taking care of children and other household-related tasks. While men have increased their involvement in the home considerably over the past few years, there is still a significant disparity, as you can tell from this graph in 2019. A 2015 study of time diaries, so actually asking folks to write down how they were spending time during the day, found that prior to the birth of a child, men and women shared household responsibilities equally. However, after the birth of a baby, women spent 4 hours more on housework and 8 hours more on childcare than men. The tasks that they assumed responsibility for also differed. Women assume tasks that have a greater mental load, meaning that there is a greater expectation for them to conduct those tasks. These might be tasks that are recurring, such as what is the family schedule or what are we going to have for dinner. Comparatively, men tend to assume tasks that have a lesser mental load, such as taking the car in for service or playing with the children. Of note, lesbian and gay couples tend to have more egalitarian arrangements than those depicted in this graph. Bias and discrimination. The root of most of the inequality seen in today's workplace is persistent gender norms and expectations that have persisted through the decades. We still have very clear conceptions of how men are expected to behave and how women are expected to behave that cloud our judgment and are rooted deeply in our subconscious, leading to unconscious bias. This is particularly problematic for women when they violate one of those gender norms, such as by acting assertively or speaking on their own behalf in a meeting. Because women are expected to be more relationship oriented and differential, that is seen as a gender violation and can actually result in backlash on behalf of that woman. One study found that women who actively negotiated on their behalf, the hiring committee was less likely to want to work with that person. What this can result in is a lack of representation, as we saw in the graph earlier, in that bias is infiltrating our hiring and promotion systems, and so we have fewer women at the top in our organizational hierarchies. Without women at the table to influence policy, these policies are not gender equitable and working for women in the workplace, and this leads to discrimination. And I want to touch on the prevalence of bias and discrimination for a moment by sharing statistics from the 2019 Women in the Workplace report. In 2019, 33% of women and 11% of men said that they had seen or heard biased behavior towards women. However, 73% of women experienced microaggressions or everyday slights rooted in bias. I should also mention that women of color, trans women, and women with disabilities experience microaggressions at a greater rate than white women. What's to note between these two statistics is the discrepancy. So despite the fact that 73% of women are experiencing bias in the workplace, only 33% of women and 11% of men are acknowledging it. So we're not recognizing biased behavior, though it's especially prevalent in the workplace. And recognition is the first step to changing it. And finally, organizational and legal policies. A few examples of this, as we will get to throughout our presentation, are inadequate leave and scheduling policies. The Family Medical Leave Act, which is a federal provision, only provides 12 weeks of unpaid leave, which is unrealistic for most families based on the amount of money they may make. Secondly, laws that do not cover or apply to all individuals. For example, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act only covers employees with 15 or more employees. So that does not cover women who may work at a small business or who work as a contractor or freelancer, which is becoming considerably more common now in our current COVID era. And finally, a failure to implement best practices related to gender equity. Only 42% of orgs in a recent survey of over 1,200 companies have designated plans for achieving gender equity. And I see a hand that is raised. Please, if you can, just because of technology limitations today, please pose your question or comment in the chat box and we will address it. Thank you. So now that we know where we started, let's talk about the effects of the current moment of COVID-19. Women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to this crisis than men's jobs. In the US, women despite accounting for 46% of employment, women have made up 43% of the jobs lost. Where jobs have not been lost is on the front line. So women are overrepresented in the frontline workforce and are risking their lives in disproportionate numbers to provide healthcare, childcare, and other essential services. And as we talked previously, family responsibilities, because of the lack of accessible childcare options, both parents have doubled the time they are spending on education household tasks, but mothers are spending an additional 15 hours more on average than fathers. This is contributing to women being 3 times more likely to quit their job due to COVID. While family responsibilities plays a significant role in this, wage inequality also plays a role. So if you're making an economic decision for your family about who needs to step away from the workforce, if the female in that relationship is making less, that's going to be the natural choice, right? That the woman would step away so the family preserves the higher source of income. This pandemic is also disproportionately affecting women of color as depicted in this graph. You can see that Black women have a 14% unemployment rate right now, and Hispanic women have a 15.3% unemployment rate right now. It is also disproportionately hitting non-college educated women. Women, generally speaking, are far more likely than men to work in part-time, low-paid, and/or tip jobs, meaning jobs that don't necessarily require a college degree. This is particularly important to note both that the COVID pandemic is hitting women of color disproportionately and those that are not college educated, because a lot of the conversation we have around workplace inequality focuses on white collar jobs or those in the Fortune 500. As we move forward and throughout this presentation, I ask you to think about when we are approaching policy and thinking about increasing gender equity for all women, that we are considering women across all age, all industries, and at all spaces within the socioeconomic lens. And so what is the primary takeaway from this section? The reality is that these are not new problems, but they are being accelerated and exacerbated by COVID. And I want to touch on just how accelerated they are. This COVID-19 pandemic threatens to set back decades of progress for gender equality in the workplace. Between the end of the Great Recession in July 2010 and the start of COVID-19, women had gained over 11 million jobs in the workplace. In April 2020, the entirety of those gains were wiped out. And that is why today we are going to talk about workplace best practices for gender equity, because ensuring that our workplaces are looking out for the best interests of women and are recovering from this recession in a way that is equitable is more important than ever. We could spend hours talking about the multitude of best practices for increasing gender equity, but today we are going to touch on 4 primarily. We are going to talk about recruiting, pay equity, benefits, and representation. We chose these 4 because they are easiest and most salient for organizations to attain, regardless of whether it is COVID times, whether we are rebuilding from this recession, whatever the organizational context is. These are the easiest and to implement for organizations to ensure gender equity. And we're going to break this down into 4 subsections as we move through it today. 1, we are going to talk about legislation and policy. It is important and illuminating to look at what is the federal and organizational policies regarding gender equity in the workplace, because they set the framework for how companies show up to safeguard the rights of their female workers. You will see throughout the presentation today that most legislation and policy comes up short, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of actively protecting the rights of women workers. Secondly, we're going to talk about evidence-based practices. What does the research say around how organizations can best ensure gender equity? Third, Jennifer is going to talk about how this looks in practice. What does this look like when it's actually implemented in the organizational context? And finally, Jennifer is going to share a section we have titled Find Your Voice. The subject and title of this conference has been Finding Your Voice, and so Jennifer is going to share some tips on how we as employees can advocate for our organizations to be more gender equitable, and also for navigating gender bias and organizational disparities as we move through our own employment trajectories. So when we look at the legislation that influences recruiting policy, the big one is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And this prohibits discrimination in hiring, compensation, and privileges related to employment based on a multitude of identities and factors. How this plays up in the hiring and recruiting process is around questions that an employer may ask. So an employer may ask what professional organizations you belong to, or if you're available to work weekends if it's related to the job, but they are not able to ask questions related to specific identities that may invite an opportunity for bias, such as, tell me about all the clubs you belong to, what place of worship do you attend, or do you wish to be addressed as Mrs., Miss, or Miss? Additionally, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 also prohibits discrimination in pregnancy, and this act ensures that within the context of the workplace, pregnancy is treated as any other disability and accommodated as such. This also plays a role in which question employers may ask, such as, when do you plan to have children is off limits, how many children do you have, or what is your maiden name? Because there is some research that shows there's an association between whether or not a woman is married and the perception of her willingness and desire to have children. From an organizational perspective, then, what are some things we can do to ensure gender equity? One is that language matters. So a good body of research has found that job ads tend to be gendered in the language that they use. So they are traditionally either masculine or feminine. An example of that, a masculine ad might be ads that focus on competitiveness or assertiveness. And an example of an ad that is more feminine in language would be one that focuses on collaboration or teamwork. What the research has found is that women found job ads with gendered wording to be less appealing and that they would have a decreased sense of belonging in those roles, and that led to them being less likely to apply. So ensuring that language and how you're presenting your company and the availability of these roles is a very important first step in the recruiting process. Secondly, unconscious bias training in close proximity to hiring or promotion decisions. Now, I will say the evidence on the effectiveness of unconscious bias training is mixed. I say close proximity to hiring promotion decisions because there has been some evidence that shows that the effects of unconscious bias training wear off after time because they're not as salient for the people who participated in it. So ensuring that it's in close proximity to hiring or promotion decisions ensures that that content is top of mind for the people that are in those roles. Unconscious bias training has also been found in some instances to result in backlash, which means that it actually has an opposite effect from what we were hoping to achieve. However, Dr. Molly Carnes and the Wisely Lab and the UW-Madison campus has done tremendous work around unconscious bias and has shown best practices around how to use it effectively. And I recommend you all check that out if you're interested. Additionally, there are 2 additional tools that organizations can use coupled with unconscious bias training to reduce bias. And those are perspective taking and a consider the opposite approach. This can increase empathy and has been shown to decrease bias, particularly with folks who have different identities throughout the organization. Third, setting company goals and targets for hiring. One of the biggest takeaways from this presentation to say today, and you will see it come up repeatedly, is that we have to, using data and analytics, limit the opportunity for bias to be injected throughout the workplace and the hiring, promotion, and retention process. So using company goals and targets can help to replace intuition, informal networks, wanting to hire a buddy, and rules of thumb or ways things have always been done to actually ensure that the way in which you are hiring new people or promoting new people is gender equitable. When it comes to setting company goals or targets specifically, they are contextual. So they are specific to the industry, organization, and role. You've seen many companies come out and say they are going to increase hiring of women by 33%, for example. That's a general average. Some industries, because of certain factors of how many women live in the area, how many women have the desired qualifications, because there are some even degree programs that are disproportionately being offered in favor of men. They may not have enough women to fill the roles if you set a very high gender quota. So these are very contextual when it comes to what these specific goals and targets should be. And fourth, conduct a blind screening of applicants, or if the process is electric, using an electronic curtain. The Boston Symphony Orchestra actually did a fascinating experiment that highlights the importance of this. They asked musicians to audition for a role in the orchestra behind a curtain. And they found that just the act of the hiring managers or the conductor, whoever chooses which musicians are going to be part of the orchestra, found that just by having them sit behind a curtain, it increased the likelihood that a female musician would advance by 50%, and it substantially increased the proportion of women hired. Now, I'm not advocating for you to interview candidates behind a curtain, but what we can do is we can remove demographic information and other cues that could trigger bias. Things like names, organizations that particularly point to certain identity groups such as gender or religion or race or ethnicity, and ensuring that as much as we can, we are orchestrating bias out of the materials that our hiring managers see. Jennifer, take it away.
So all of that is great information, and it's important information because it sets the foundation for how recruiting works. In practice, sometimes it doesn't quite play out the same way as what we're aiming for. So, for example, some people don't fully understand that even though legally it is it's against the law to ask certain questions based on gender, based on what your plans are with children, etc. People don't always understand how far that extent goes. So educating ourselves on it is really important, which is why having potentially the kinds of training before a hiring can be very helpful for the organization, but as Kayla said, it can also create backlash. And part of the issue is that even though HR can put out all sorts of information around what people can and cannot say, implicit bias is still something that exists for people, and sometimes those people are not even aware of their own implicit bias. So what it does is it requires people inside the organization to have courage to call it out when they see it, and that includes people on the interview team as well as in HR. And I always like to have people focus on what they do want to hear about from an interview versus what they don't want to hear about. So I do want to hear about their skills and experience. I do want to hear about their specific answer to a behavioral-based interview question, which means they're talking about a very specific past experience that highlights their ability to do something like that in our organization. So the thing here is that the recruiting process in an organization can pass the, quote, legal test and still not be as supportive of diversity and inclusion as what we want it to be. It can also not result in a diverse workforce that represents the community that the organization operates inside of. So when we switch from what does an organization do to what can you do as an individual in finding your own voice, it's really important to do your own research on the company and to understand what their interview process is. Whenever you are interviewing for a job, or if you are part of a hiring team, think about it from the perspective of what the interview process says about the organization. How much are they using best practices? How much are they honing in on the very specific things that tell the organization what the skills and experiences are of the person, as opposed to the more superficial components, which include gender. And look at who's on the interview team for diversity and representation. Do they all look the same? Because if they do, that's a red flag. And I think it's a good idea to ask questions regarding an organization's diversity and inclusion programs and efforts during the interview process. Some people can feel concerned about asking questions like this during an interview process because they want to get the job, and I completely understand that. What I would tell you, though, is what you learn in the recruiting process is a microcosm of what will be true on a day-to-day basis in the organization once you have the job. So those are just a few things in practice. I would encourage you to put in the chat box what else you have seen work in your experience. Please drop it in the chat box and share it with other participants in the session.
Yes, please. As we mentioned earlier, this list is by no means exhaustive. And so please share other practices in the chat. We would love to see them and start a discussion around them. Moving on to pay equity. So one of the biggest pieces of federal legislation related to pay equity is the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And this stated that companies have to pay the same wages for identical but not comparable jobs. However, they included quite a big caveat in that they said wage discrepancies are allowed if they're based on seniority, merit, or a differential based on any factor other than sex. These caveats actually make it very difficult for women to win cases under the Equal Pay Act. Additionally, the Lilly Ledbetter Pay Act was passed in 2009, and it set a 180-day statute of limitations under which employees may sue for discrimination that resets after each paycheck. The limitation of this, however, is that oftentimes women do not find out that they have experienced pay discrimination within the 180-day statute of limitations. Third, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which was first introduced in 1997 and has yet to pass, would prohibit employers from asking job applicants' salary history and would require employers to prove that pay disparities are job-related. Because the federal legislation surrounding pay equity is limited, many states have actually stepped up and set their own equal pay laws. Unlike many states, Wisconsin does not have a set equal pay law, but they do mention pay discrimination in the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act. So it actually says in the language that compensation is a form of discrimination that is covered under the act. In 2009, Wisconsin also passed the Equal Pay Enforcement Act, which was repealed in 2012 and has been reintroduced and is in the process of trying to be passed right now. Many of the provisions of this act are similar to the Paycheck Fairness Act in what they would protect for employees in the state of Wisconsin. And then finally, and most importantly, increasing the minimum wage. We talked earlier that women are disproportionately represented in jobs that are lower paying. And so increasing the minimum wage is a very important element of ensuring that women are being able to meet their basic needs of life, and also we're closing the pay gap over time. From an organizational perspective, one of the most fundamental things an organization can do is conduct a pay audit. And so that means actually looking across the organization to ensure that all jobs and comparable jobs and identical jobs are actually making the same salary regardless of who is occupying that role. Other things to include within that audit are benefits and job titles, as oftentimes those can also show a gender imbalance. Secondly, encourage negotiation and normalize pay transparency. I touched on it earlier, but women can actually face backlash for negotiating on their behalf because it is viewed as a gender role violation. However, the process of encouraging negotiation and normalizing pay transparency actually help to lessen the discrepancy in women's willingness to initiate negotiation on their own behalf. So when job postings explicitly said that the salary was negotiable, signaling that their culture was supportive of negotiation. In other studies, they have found when organizations posted the salary range, so women could go into a negotiation informed around the context between which they could successfully negotiate, the gender effects actually were diminished between how often men and women were likely to start a negotiation conversation. And third, structuring performance evaluation and appraisal procedures to reduce bias. Subjective performance appraisals are still the norm in most contexts. So asking a manager to provide a personal appraisal or evaluation of how an employee is doing based on oftentimes very subjective factors. Obviously, this provides ample opportunity for bias. So the Women's Leadership Lab out of Stanford actually recently conducted a study, and they found that creating a rubric and using specific prompts that asked for measurable outcomes was able to limit some of the bias within the performance evaluation process. So actually creating a rubric prior to the evaluation period and asking managers to use that rubric to evaluate their employees' effectiveness. And also, instead of saying, tell me what you thought of Julie's performance, rephrasing the question to say, tell me the specific ways that Julie has contributed to advancing X organizational goal, was found to reduce bias within the evaluation process.
So Kayla mentioned that there's a big hole in some of the legislation around how pay is set. And it's true, most organizations differentiate pay based on performance, experience, tenure, and it makes it extremely difficult to assess pay equity in the same job. And unfortunately, the same themes show up here. Implicit bias still exists. Kayla identified some great ideas. I would say calibration in an organization around performance ratings also can help because it allows for more voices around the table and more visibility around, are we particularly rating men higher than women when it comes to performance. So sunlight is sometimes the best approach. And what do I mean by that? Transparency around compensation practices and how much transparency there is critical in terms of assessing whether that implicit bias is taking hold or not. So I think one of the things for finding your voice is being able to look at an organization and assess how transparent they are around compensation. So what does that look like? If I were in a conversation and I wanted to have more transparency around my compensation, I would ask for the market comparison used for my job that is applied for everyone in that role. I would look at how I was paid against the median of that job and try to assess if that matches my experiences and skills. If I have the requisite experience and skills, I should be paid at about the median of the position. And if I'm not, then that's a great place to ask a bunch of questions. And ideally, that same job range is being used for everybody in that role. So you can look at compensation information online. Lots of people look at Glassdoor or salary.com. I will tell you it's a bit of a trap. Those are self-reported numbers and people don't always tell the truth online, I'm sure you've all experienced that. So I would focus more on what your organization compares against from a market perspective and ask for that transparency on what the pay range is and what the median is. Additionally, understand the compensation philosophy of the organization. Is it their philosophy to pay people at the median? Is it their philosophy to pay people under the median? Hopefully the organization has something that is either published or that you can take a look at. And if not, that's also telling you information around the structure and formality they have around their compensation. And then have the hard conversation with your manager and advocate for yourself and ask a lot of questions. Most people are uncomfortable talking about pay, including many managers. I would say that it's incumbent upon you, even if it feels uncomfortable, to have that conversation, because there are plenty of managers who will avoid it. So definitely gear up, get ready, walk in prepared for your conversation, but it's important to be able to ask those questions, and the more you exercise that muscle, the better you will get at it. And then the other thing is on the recruitment, don't answer. If you get asked what your past pay was, my recommendation is to not answer that. Tell them what you want to be paid and understand what the compensation looks like in the marketplace for that position when you answer the question. There is legislation in some places that they cannot ask you for your past pay, but it's inconsistent, but you don't have to answer what you were previously paid. So please drop any other experiences you've seen used successfully in the chat box, and we'll move to the next one.
Moving on to benefits. One of the most prevalent federal legislation related to benefits for particularly working mothers is the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. FMLA provides 12 weeks of unpaid leave to employers with 50 or more employees. And this can cover birth or adoption of child, care for a spouse or parent, or a serious health condition of the employees themselves. 4 states, California, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island, currently offer paid family and medical leave, and 5 states require their private corporations to provide paid sick leave in some capacity. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Family Medical Leave Act provides 2 weeks of leave for an employee's own serious health condition, 2 weeks to care for someone in the immediate family, and up to 6 weeks for the birth or adoption of a child. To combat the negative effects of the coronavirus, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was also recently passed, and this provides up to 2 weeks of paid leave if you come down with the coronavirus, and an extra 10 weeks of paid salary if your child's school or daycare provider is closed or unavailable. And when we say paid salary, it is 2/3 of your normal salary range. And this covers employers with fewer than 500 employees. A little note about the FMLA is actually how few employees can actually access it. So only 13% of private sector workers have paid family leave, and 41% of private sector workers have medical or short-term disability leave at all. So while this federal law exists to try and protect workers and give them time away, very few people actually are able to use it because A, they're not able to afford taking unpaid leave, or they don't have access to it because of their job classifications and the way the law is written. From an organizational perspective then, one of the biggest barriers to workforce participation for women is disproportional family responsibilities, as we mentioned earlier. So offering and encouraging paid parental and caregiver leave is imperative. And I say parental leave instead of maternity leave because while maternity leave is important, assuming that women only take maternity leave, we are contributing to the stigma that women are held the primary responsibility for caring for their children. So actually allowing for and encouraging both mothers and fathers to take paid leave can reduce that stigma and reduce the barriers that mothers receive in the workplace around what's called the motherhood penalty. The US remains the only industrialized nation without guaranteed paid leave, and studies have shown that paid leave increases women's labor force participation exponentially. Additionally, allowing for flexibility, and this can be accomplished in a variety of ways, either by including flex time, scheduling autonomy, or remote work options. Studies have found that the premium that women place on flexible work is a key factor in occupational segregation, which we discussed earlier. High-paying industries such as law, medicine, healthcare as a whole require considerably long hours that conflict oftentimes with women's ability to care for their families. And so in some cases, that is a factor that is allowing women and causing women to self-select out of participation in those industries. So providing workplace flexibility, acknowledging that employees are both employees and parents in many cases, and or are caregivers for other family members such as parents, allows them to actually show up effectively in both places. And flexible work arrangements have been shown to improve wages for mothers, especially those with a university education. And finally, professional development and leadership opportunities. Research has shown that when it comes to opportunities and the qualifications that women need to advance within an organization, they just have disproportionate access, meaning that women lack access to what are called developmental opportunities to grow in their own leadership abilities. So organizations should first track and provide opportunities for women to obtain these stretch assignments. So looking and seeing, are we providing these opportunities in a way that is gender equitable? And if not, creating programming to ensure that women have access to them. Secondly, creating mentoring program and providing funds for external professional development. Mentoring and particularly sponsorship have shown to be extremely effective for women in the workplace in terms of advancement and gender equity. However, because of bias and scheduling limitations, women are less likely to have access to a mentor or a sponsor. So formal programs can reduce that barrier and ensure women have access to those important figures in their professional development. If you are working at an organization that has few women at the top, providing funds for women to pursue external professional development opportunities is important. If you don't have access to women in leadership, or those women don't necessarily reflect you and your identities, it is important for women to be able to seek that fellowship and mentorship outside of the organization. And third, ensuring networking and company functions are inclusive. Oftentimes, company happy hours or staff outings to the golf course, for example, may not either appeal to women and or may not work with their schedules. If you're a working parent and have to pick up your child from school, you're not going to be able to attend the happy hour directly after work around 5 p.m. So ensuring that you are providing a wide variety of networking and company functions that are inclusive for women, regardless of their engagement preferences, is an important first step to help women build social capital, which is so important in terms of advancing throughout the organization.
So the great part about benefits is that they typically are a bit more transparent and available for everybody to see what is offered to people. Generally, most employers have them published, and you can go out and look at it. There can be stigma around taking certain benefits if you're in the pool of people that can, like FMLA. That could come from your manager or from your team, as they feel the effects of having one of their people be gone for up to 12 weeks. So it's important to understand and watch what other people are doing in the organization. This is a great place for leadership to demonstrate that it's good to take this leave by doing it themselves. And in some cases, benefits may be lacking compared to what is needed. So previously, prior to COVID-19, most employers said, no, you cannot work from home. I think we've all proven that you can, and you can do it effectively. And so it's possible that more employers will have that kind of flexibility as we come out of this as well. It's important from a finding your voice perspective to again, understand what's offered, what is published. Most people pay attention to the healthcare offerings when they first take a job and or are well into their job at that organization, and they only really look at the other benefits when they have an issue or need something. But I encourage you to spend time really understanding all that is offered, because there could be something that you're leaving on the table that you shouldn't be. Your benefits are really part of your compensation, your total compensation, so it's important to understand them and take advantage of them. In addition, if you can talk with others, so if you have other people that are impacted by similar kinds of situations and you sense that there's a benefit that's lacking, you can go and advocate either with HR or with your manager for a benefit that may be needed, and be able to make the case for it. A lot of times the benefits that people are really looking for, like being able to work from home, don't necessarily impact the bottom line of an organization. And so there's potentially, depending on how progressive the organization is, they may be willing to take that input. And then taking advantage of what exists. Sometimes our biggest obstacle is not taking advantage of that. So for example, in 2018, 768 million vacation days went unused, with more than 55% of workers saying they did not use all of their time. Taking vacation time is good for you. So that's just one example of being able to take advantage of what's being offered to you. And I'll ask again, what other practices have you seen that have been successful? Please feel free to drop them in the chat.
Moving on to representation. So generally when we talk about representation, you hear two words that are extremely contentious: targets and quotas. The United States does not set any gender quotas mandating that companies or government ensures that they're represented, that women are represented in certain contexts. 80 other nations, however, do. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Global Gender Index, many of those countries actually do better in terms of gender equity than the United States. Most of the quotas in other nations are related to representation in government. However, a few, such as Norway, have set quotas related to board membership for publicly traded companies. Within the United States, in 2019, California became the first state requiring at least one woman on boards, and depending on the size of the firm, more than one woman. And they were the first US state to do so. This is obviously highly controversial here in the United States because there's a question of whether or not it violates equal protection. So by ensuring that these spots on the board are reserved for women, are we prioritizing their gender at the expense of others? So is that an unequal treatment in terms of hiring? Instead of quotas or mandates, many companies have set gender targets that they have both publicly declared and are publicly reporting on their progress. And you've seen the gamut from companies taking their own initiatives to do so to some pledges that have actually circulated around the United States, where some of the big Fortune 500s are actually signing on and committing to ensuring there's a certain representation of their workforce of women. However, it should be noted that findings on outcomes related to both targets and quotas are mixed. So women can actually face backlash and can be viewed as less qualified if it is assumed that they are hired because of a quota or target system. And finally, particularly when it comes to women's representation on boards set in relation to targets or quotas, it is found to have a limited effect, unfortunately, on gender parity throughout the rest of the organization. So though we think sometimes that ensuring representation at the top will lead to gender parity throughout, unfortunately, some of the systems and biases are so deeply ingrained throughout that representation alone is not going to solve them. So what can we do from an organizational best practice perspective? Provide and create equal opportunity, which I talked about previously. Women often are denied access to developmental opportunities they need to develop the competencies to rise within an organization, particularly to the level of the C-suite. So ensuring that women have equal opportunities to those experiences is extremely important. Secondly, encouraging women to apply. So I think we've all seen the statistic that men will apply for a job if they meet 60% of the qualifications, but women will only apply for a job if they meet 100%, right? This discrepancy was actually lessened if women were explicitly encouraged to apply. So this is something organizations can do by saying, we're looking for women, or reaching out to women leaders and encouraging them to apply for a certain spot or promotion, but also something we can do within our own network by sharing jobs and encouraging women to apply for certain jobs that we become aware of that are opening. And third, using data analytics to identify barriers to advancement. And Google is a great example of this. They did data analysis of their entire workforce, and they found that they had an identified parent gap. So when an employee had a baby, women were leaving at disproportionate rates of men. So mothers were leaving more than fathers. And so what they did is they introduced a new maternity-paternity policy based on that finding, and mothers are now no more likely to leave than the average employee. So being able to actually analyze where in the retention, promotion, recruitment pipeline you are losing employees is very important to ensuring that the policies that you are implementing are actually addressing the problems themselves. Another great example of this is the Woman in the Workplace report in 2019, which I have referenced earlier. For a long time, a lot of the conversation has focused on this glass ceiling or a barrier to women excelling to the very top levels of an organizational hierarchy. But the Women in the Workplace report, after doing an analysis of the entire talent pipeline, found actually the broken rung is a significant barrier to women's advancement. And the broken rung refers to the first promotion. So when it comes to a first promotion in an employee's career, a disproportionate amount of men are being promoted compared to women. And so now that we know that, as an industry and as folks interested in gender equity, we can devote some of our energy and attention and resources to fixing that broken rung and fixing gender equity throughout the organization.
So As Kayla mentioned, most organizations have lower representation of women and minorities in their executive ranks and on their board of directors. And this exists for lots of reasons, and the broken rung is certainly a huge contributing factor. It can exist and be exacerbated throughout the cycle of a woman's career. And it's so fascinating because in the organizations I've worked for, having representation is a virtuous cycle. The more representation you have, the more likely it is that people continue to get promoted. And that's because those women and minority voices at the table, when discussions are happening, it broadens their viewpoints and increases the likelihood that their voices are elevated. However, having been the only woman around an executive table, I can tell you it is challenging to be the one that has to then speak up on gender issues. It is extremely important to have, quite frankly, white men who are willing to advocate for these issues and say it's important to them as well. And so I encourage people to broaden out. It's great to have people that you feel like share your concerns, but also network and work with people who believe in the same kind of philosophy and ideas you have and get them to help advocate for this as well. So asking, we talked about a little earlier, but asking for sponsorship or mentorship for you or for others in the organization to help can be really important. And a lot of times we think of that as people are approaching the executive ranks, but it's really important actually to do it for people that are looking to get into their first level of leadership. So they've been an individual contributor and now they want to move into a supervisory position. Getting sponsorship and mentorship for them so that they A, get into that position, and B, have the support once they're in the position to deal with the challenges that come at them can be very important. And then look around your network and identify talented women and minorities that you know and refer them into positions that are being hired for. Why is this important? We already know that recruiters and HR like to know that somebody knows the person coming in. It increases their likelihood of being hired. So helping to do that and asking the person to apply makes it much more likely that they actually put their hat in the ring. Any other ideas you have? Drop them in the chat.
So to wrap up, we just wanted to share our recommendations. And these are the overwhelming takeaways. We hope if you remember nothing else, you remember these concepts today. One is the importance of embracing an intersectional and inclusive lens. We have to broaden the conversation beyond the success of women in predominantly Fortune 500 organizations and higher leadership roles. We have to look at across industries, across socioeconomic status, how are we truly implementing policies that affect all women, regardless of where you're at in your employment journey, what your race, ethnicity is, or what your socioeconomic background is, because that's the only way to truly achieve true gender equity. Secondly, as we mentioned today, you will see that at no point in our presentation did we talk about faults of women. Women aren't opting out of the workforce. Women don't have lesser leadership skills. Women don't have a preference for staying home. There are deeply ingrained organizational biases that are preventing women from accelerating and staying in the workforce in the numbers that would achieve gender equity. And so focusing on those organizational and legislative policies that actually make it possible for women to participate in the workforce in equal numbers is absolutely important. Things like family leave, childcare, pay equity, representation, we can all advocate for systems level change. And then third, develop a game plan. And I want to break this down into both an organizational and an individual level. At an organizational level, gender equity is not going to be achieved without attention and intentional effort. The fact that only 42% of companies in 2019 in that representative survey had a gender equity report leads me to believe that if we're going to continue doing what we've always done, we're going to keep getting the results we've always gotten, and that is a gender and equitable workforce. And so we have to be intentional around how organizations are approaching gender equity, and as employees and as women and people who care about gender equity, ensuring that our organizations are held responsible for doing so. And secondly, as individuals, we have to develop and practice navigating instances of bias before we find ourselves in one. I think we're having a really interesting conversation right now around what does women's leadership mean and what should it entail. And as you can see, the biases that hold women back are in an organizational context, but we spend very little time talking about them and even less time navigating them. Prior to graduate school, I worked in football. And the best example I can give to highlight this actually ironically comes from that space. Student athletes spend all year honing their own craft. They're working on their body, they're perfecting how they run their own execution routes or perform in their own position. But the minute that schedule comes out, they're also scouting the other team. They're watching game film. They're understanding that on third down, when the team does this, I am best prepared to respond in this way. You don't walk in and play Alabama without a game plan, and we can't be sending women into the workforce to navigate bias, harassment, and other inequities without actively preparing them and providing them an opportunity to build confidence before they step in there. I can speak from personal experience. Incidents in which I was unprepared, that I was not prepared to handle, were psychologically damaging. I fumbled through my words in the moment. I didn't know what to say. I stayed up for the next 3 months analyzing every word that I did say. I would have been much more equipped and handled those situations much better if I would have intentionally prepared, if I'd known what I was going to encounter and intentionally prepared for how I was going to execute in that moment when I encountered it. Is that fair? No. But as women, stepping up and asserting ourselves as individuals is one way to advance gender equity for everyone.
I'll echo some of what Kayla has said and just add a little bit, which is to do your research. Look beyond the stated values of an organization for how people are actually behaving. What does their representation look like? Just because somebody or an organization tells you that they believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, it does not mean that that's how they actually behave. So do the work to find out what is reality. Advocate for yourself. Nobody cares as much about your career and what's happening for you as you do. And so you need to find a way to be comfortable asking for what you need and taking advantage of what already exists. Even if the research shows you that you might have a negative backlash for negotiating on a job, do it anyway. Because if you do have a backlash, you learned something very important about that organization before you joined it. And find your voice, even when it feels awkward, even when you aren't sure. Approach the situation and try to do it with as much confidence as possible, because it matters in terms of how you feel about that interaction and whether you feel good about how you showed up at the end of the day.
Well said, Jennifer. With that, we will open it up to questions. And for this portion, we will allow folks to raise their hands. If you want to use the raise hand function and ask your question to the group, feel free to do so. You may also, if you feel more comfortable, post them in the chat.
Maybe while we're waiting for questions to come in, we'll just tell everybody before too many people drop off. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found the information compelling and illuminating. And if you would like to, you can connect with either one of us. Our contact information is available here. And we'll continue to stay on for a bit to see if anybody has questions and be able to answer those. Anything you want to add, Kayla?
No, I echo what you said. Thank you all for taking time out to be with us today. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in continuing this conversation offline. I love to talk about gender and leadership any day of the week, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Kayla, can you say more about consider the opposite approach?
Yeah. So what these two exercises that I mentioned, both perspective taking and consider the opposite approach, focus on the principle of empathy. So allowing an employee to actually put themselves in another employee's shoes. And this can come up a lot of times when there's a workplace discrepancy or someone feels as though you call someone essentially on an instance of bias, or you feel as though an employee is potentially behaving or saying something that is influenced by bias. And so let's say, for example, you're talking about a performance evaluation and someone says, Linda really wasn't committed this month to X objective. Linda wasn't committed, and that's because she doesn't care about her job. What you can simply say is, could you consider that instead of not being committed to her job, she's been spending a lot of time on X project? Do you think it's possible that that was influencing her ability to show up? So asking those questions in a way that asks them to consider an alternative perspective than the biased one that they are presenting in that moment can help them think through some of the bias, hopefully acknowledge it and understand that that's what's clouding their thinking in that moment, but also entertain other possibilities for why they may be perceiving that situation in that way.
Yeah, great example. And another component to consider when asking challenging questions is open-ended questions tend to make people less defensive and more actually willing to think through what's happening inside of them. Open-ended questions start with what and how. And so what makes you consider that that's what the reason is, or how did you come to this conclusion, can help open up the conversation a little bit more to understand what's going on for them.
Thank you, Ian, for being here.
You want to take that one, Kayla?
Yeah. So one of the resources that I've actually learned about recently is that the University of Wisconsin actually has an ombudsman, and they are a confidential resource that you can actually talk to if you have concerns around workplace inequality. You can find that resource on the website. Additionally, each unit on campus should have HR representatives that are available. If you don't necessarily feel comfortable talking to your own unit's HR representatives, there are some through Central Campus that you can speak to. Additionally, I've seen instances of that where if you're not comfortable talking to, particularly if you have a small unit and you're not comfortable talking to HR folks within that specifically, you can reach out to folks on Central Campus as well. I know there are other resources on campus. Feel free to drop them in the chat, but those are two that are kind of your first go-tos. Additionally, I will mention now that we are post-Me Too movement, the National Women's Law Center has a national hotline if you have experienced sexual harassment specifically, and they are providing free legal consultation to some women. So if something has happened that fits the definition of sexual harassment and you want to talk to someone outside of your organization altogether, that is a tremendous resource that is available. They also have PAVE online has a chatbot that you can reach out to. So a lot of organizations are looking to provide more resources to women to help navigate some of these workplace instances of bias, sexual harassment, discrimination.
Great, maybe just give it another minute for questions to roll in, and then if nothing else pops up, we'll go ahead and close and say thank you again to everybody for attending.
Thank you, Sheridan Blanford.